Like most Jewish children, my father had two sets of names. The one that appears on his birth certificate, Isaac Jonas, would soon give way to Isidore, and eventually Irving, which stuck. But his Hebrew name would never change. At his Brit Milah, the circumcision ceremony 8 days before he was born, my father was given the name Yitzchak Yonah, or to be more precise, Yitzchak Yonah ben Yehuda Yosef. In English, it means Isaac Jonah, son of Judah Joseph. Yehuda Yosef, my grandfather, took the name Louis when he came to America in 1899. The only time I heard my grandfather referred to by his Hebrew name was in synagogue, when my father was given the honor of reciting the blessing before a passage of the Torah was read aloud. The cantor would ask my father for his Hebrew name, which he would then recite to the entire congregation. Yitzchak Yonah ben Yehuda Yosef. It seems strange that to this day, my father's Hebrew name rolls off my tongue, almost as if I had used it every day while he was alive. Once a year, Irving would leave for synagogue to recite prayers in memory of Louis, who passed away on the eve of Rosh Hashanah in 1944, 4 years before I was born. My father performed this annual ritual alone. When he returned home from synagogue, the family would sit down to an elaborate dinner to welcome in the new year. Not once did my father ever take the occasion to talk about Louis, for whom he had just lit a memorial candle that would burn right next to the dinner table for the next 24 hours. In fact, my father almost never spoke to his children about either of his parents. No stories about their lives in Eastern Europe, no stories about their passage to America, which in my grandmother's case included several years in London, no stories about their early struggles on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, no trips to Auburn, where they raised 3 children, and no visits to Far Rockaway, where they lived out the rest of their lives. It never occurred to me that this was in any way unusual until many years later. From all accounts, my father had a close and loving relationship with both of his parents. Why then did he fail to pass on almost any detail about their lives to his own family? I suppose it was because my father was a practical man who saw little value in the past. His focus was firmly on the present or the future. There was little room in my father's heart for sentiment. So knowledge about my grandparents, Louis and Bertha Bader, was almost non-existent. But a passing comment that my mother made at the dinner table, only once, struck me with great force. She recalled that my father's parents had once lived in Atania. She didn't say exactly where this was, and she probably didn't know. But in sober tones, she told her children never to forget the name of this place. Although I had little knowledge about my grandparents, I was filled with curiosity. What possessed 2 young people, barely out of their teens, to leave the country of their birth, their family and friends, for a place they didn't even speak the language? I would later find out that they brought with them no savings to fall back on while they struggled to gain a foothold in America. Their blue-collar occupations, tailor and cigarette maker, were not promising avenues to the comforts of a middle-class life. Surely this was a story worth pursuing. But how? My parents were gone, and they left precious little behind, save for a few old photographs. One showed a picture of my grandparents around the time of their marriage, looking straight on at the camera, well dressed, but unsmiling. My grandfather sported a handlebar mustache, which was popular at the time. My grandmother was wearing a black dress with a high Victorian collar. The other photograph showed my father around age 5, perched on a log between his parents. My father and his mother both showed the hint of a smile as Louis looked on sternly. All three were very well dressed in their winter finest. But that was pretty much it as far as information about my grandparents was concerned. My quest to uncover details about Louis and Bertha began in the late 1990s, before the internet became popular. I traveled to the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue, or to a branch of the National Archives on Varick Street in Lower Manhattan, in search of some basic facts. Where did my grandparents come from? When did they arrive in America? Where did they live when they got here? How did they make a living? Did their parents or siblings also make the journey? Did they ever become citizens? Answers to these questions were locked away in old-fashioned card catalogs. If you were lucky, you could find your relative's name on one of the cards, which in turn referred to a spool of microfilm that contained an image of an historical document, like a ship's manifest or census record. You'd fill out a request for that specific microfilm and wait for the librarian to retrieve it from their repository. The process could take 15 to 30 minutes, after which you could then load the film onto a machine that would magnify the images. By slowly turning a wheel, you could scroll through the microfilm until you got to the image you were searching for. Frequently, it was impossible to positively identify the person in the document as your relative. And after many failed attempts, I found there were literally dozens of people with the names Louis or Bertha Bader. But eventually, I hit the jackpot. I came across an image from the 1920 federal census that fired my imagination and led me on a search that has lasted nearly 20 years. There it was, plain as day. Louis and Bertha Bader, then in their late 30s, were living at 9 72nd Street in Auburn Village, Queens, with their daughter Pearl, age 13, son Nathan, age 12, and son Isidore, as my father was then known, age 4. And there was more. Further to the right, it stated that both of my grandparents were from Austria, and that my grandfather was a manufacturer of cloaks and suits. The term cloaks has long since gone out of our vocabulary, but in those days it referred to what we now call overcoats. This brought back memories of my father, who sometimes referred to coat manufacturers as cloakies.